sometimes the map isn't the final product. The final product there is that you've just got everybody talking about stewardship, talking about a land that they all want to protect, but maybe they all have different visions for how it can be protected. And this tool just gets everybody around the table to have those discussions.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Learning Lab. This is Ma Earth's online community where we share tools, skills, resources, and stories in service of planetary health and regeneration. I'm Sophia Rocklin, representing Ma Earth, and I'm really excited to be joined today by Cameron Ellis, who is the Field Science Director at Rainforest Foundation, US. Cameron and I used to work together at Rainforest Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization founded in 1988. Rainforest Foundation works in Central and South America in tropical ecosystems stewarded by Indigenous peoples. And they're working on developing advocacy tools and legal and territorial tools that can support them in their claims to land as extractive industries continue to destroy these beautiful and important global ecosystems. I'm very excited to have more in-depth conversation about participatory mapping, community mapping, drone technology, and how this can be used by local communities to defend their claims to land tenure. Mapping is also an amazing technology to actually support the intergenerational transmission of traditional ecological knowledge. So I'm very excited to have Cameron join us today. And Cameron, I'll let you take it away. Thank you so much for joining us here at Learning Lab.
Thanks for the introduction, Sophia. My name is Cameron Ellis. I am the Field Science Director with Rainforest Foundation US. As Sophia mentioned, we are a US-based nonprofit that supports, broadly, the way I like to describe it is we support territorial security for Indigenous communities in Central and South America. That's a very broad umbrella, and sort of the way that we look at it is the first step to territorial security is recognizing land rights. I'm going to get into a little bit of that in the presentation. Another big part of territorial security is protecting those land rights. So protecting communities from illegal logging, illegal mining, land invasions, other threats to their territories. We try to do it in a very holistic way where we are working with grassroots Indigenous organizations everywhere we go. We, in addition to working on land rights, work a lot with those organizations on capacity strengthening and just sort of building up the tool sets and skills needed to assert and defend land rights in Central and South America. So I'm going to try to touch on all those things throughout the presentation, but that's a little bit of a background on who we are as an organization and who I am as a person. Yes, I'm phoning in from Central Idaho. I'm originally from Seattle, Washington, although I grew up sort of in between the States and Central Mexico. And I guess before I get started here, I'll just talk a little bit about how I got into this work. Ever since I was really little, I was just like fascinated with maps, with, sort of the wild part, rural, distant parts of the Americas. And my just sort of inner compass always pointed me to the mountains and the coasts and all the places far away from cities and all the towns that maybe weren't on the map at that point in time. Eventually, I, through enough of those sort of travels and typically working in all of those places, one of the themes that became really prevalent, I worked as a mountain guide, I worked as a scuba guide, I worked as an English language teacher, I did a number of different jobs in those places in Central and South America. And one of the themes that was just persistent across all of those locations was just a fundamental lack of land rights and land security, particularly for indigenous communities and for communities that are living on collective land. So communities that have sort of a collective ancestral connection to their land that was not reflected in government documents. It was not formally recognized by respective governments. And it left communities that have a generations, often, a relationship with the land that stretches back into time immemorial, were often left without fundamental land rights. And that made them very vulnerable to external threats. And it made them vulnerable to other types of threats that I'll get into in this presentation. So that's a little bit about, who we are, how I got into this work. And I will say that it started from a sort of selfish point of view. I wanted to go to these places. I wanted to explore. I wanted to adventure. And slowly, as I got older, I started seeing some of these themes that you see across the Americas, and trying to figure out sort of what are the best ways to address them. And it's turned into sort of my passion, my mission, and the mission of Rainforest Foundation US. So I feel very fortunate to be able to work in this space, and look forward to sharing a few of our projects. This is just a small subset of our projects, but look forward to sharing them. And then also really look forward to hearing from people on the call about what you're doing with lands or in landscapes. And hopefully, if I can get through this fast enough, have a nice discussion about, about the tools people are using, the challenges people are facing, any questions that I maybe can answer, maybe not. Okay, so the title for this presentation is Mapping for Land Rights. I really could talk about it from a bunch of different perspectives. My formal background is, sort of the tool of my trade is mapping. I do lots of different types of mapping that we'll get into in this presentation. I have a master's in evolutionary anthropology, and so I sort of blend the anthropology side of my formal training with mapping tools that I've largely just sort of picked up along the way. And you'll see a little bit of how those two sort of disciplines blend into this work. So the two countries that I'm going to talk about today are Guyana and Panama. So you can see them on this map. I think most people know exactly where Panama is. Not everyone is familiar with Guyana. It is on the sort of northeastern shoulder of South America, and it's part of the larger Guyana Shield ecosystem. And I'm going to talk in depth about somewhat of depth, about both of these geographies and some slight, different contexts that we use participatory mapping in both of these geographies. We as an organization also work in Peru, Brazil, Ecuador, and a number of other countries in Central and South America, but I'm just going to focus on these two countries for now and for the purposes of brevity in this presentation. And before I get into that, I want to talk about like two of the big themes that are central to my work, and I think are, just kind of like core concepts, one for me, but I think also for thinking about sort of the big picture of land, thinking about the big picture of sort of regenerative land uses, and then also thinking about just how people interact with the land in the many different ways people do that and how it looks everywhere. And the first thing I want to talk about is collective land rights. When we talk about indigenous people, indigenous people are just like other people, right? But one thing that's unique about them throughout the Americas, and particularly Central and South America, is that most of them practice collective land use. So that means that rather than having individual personal parcels that individuals or families own, the entire community owns the landscape that they use and that they occupy. And we find that this is a more accurate reflection of kind of the cultural and spiritual connections that many people have to the landscape, rather than kind of parcelizing and privatizing individual pieces of land. So I'm going to talk more about that through the presentation. And before I do that, I just want to mention that, this type of land use, this type of relationship with the land is consistently across the board for decades, something that's been documented with, better land stewardship, better governance, better environmental outcomes. It's just a unique feature of indigenous communities, or it's not unique to indigenous communities, although many indigenous communities practice collective land rights. But there are other types of communities that practice similar land rights. And so I don't want to be exclusive of, just indigenous communities in this presentation. We also work with other rural and agricultural communities that have a collective relationship with their landscape. After this, and if we send out any other materials, I can send along a lot of the scientific papers that sort of back up this claim that collective land rights result in much better environmental governance, stewardship type outcomes. They also happen to support local subsistence economies really well. And collective land rights are a great way for communities to address external big threats much better than a collection of small individual properties that you see sort of everywhere in the world become really vulnerable to extractive industries and land invasions. So hopefully we'll get to some of these themes throughout the presentation. And then the other sort of, kind of top theme that I want to talk about is participatory mapping. Um, you know, um, Participatory mapping is something that's been around for many decades. It's sort of a traditional practice among a lot of anthropologists and a lot of people who work with rural communities. It's also something that's practiced in urban settings, in places where, cities and towns are trying to figure out new bike paths and new ways to sort of structure urban environments. So it's a practice that I think is very relevant to rural work with indigenous communities, but it's also applicable in a lot of urban settings, a lot of settings here in the United States. Actually, a lot of the stuff that I've sort of learned from a technical perspective has been working with rural communities here in Idaho. So I think it's a skill set that's, applicable in the context that we're going to talk about today, but also applicable in a number of other contexts. Participatory mapping really means that the maps that are generated are community driven and inclusive. They prioritize local knowledge. So what we're trying to capture in a participatory map is the local relationship and the local knowledge of the landscape, rather than coming and sort of delivering information to a community. Sometimes you see people saying, "Oh, here's satellite images of your community. Here is some other sort of remote sensing for your community. Isn't this information interesting to you?" The point here is to turn that around and say, "Hey, what information do you have? How can we capture that information? And how can we ultimately build narratives that support land rights cases?" The purpose of all of this is to formally establish and record different communities' connection with their landscape. And that can only be done by going to the community, talking to the people who live in the community, and really understanding how they use the landscape today, what their, spiritual connection is to the landscape, and what threats they're seeing in their landscape. So this is really the purpose of this is to generate community maps. There are a number of different ways that these are generated. I'll talk about a couple of them. And I think the important thing to know is that this is really about building the local map, the local vision, and the local understanding of how a landscape functions and what the human connection is to that landscape. And, then we can start throwing in some of the other more sophisticated technological tools to enhance that understanding, but really starting with the community understanding and vision for the landscape. And, in my case, in the case of our organization, we are committed not just to the land rights, not just to the final product, but to a process that's inclusive of the communities and leaves them in control of any knowledge generated on their land, any maps that are generated on their land, and the ability to to use those for advocacy, use those for continued learning, and use those for management going forward. So this is really, not about me going down and doing mapping, but really about sort of building the capacity within communities to create their own knowledge, document their own knowledge, um, and use it in court cases, use it in local management, and also be able to assimilate other types of information into their own maps as necessary. I'll get into a little bit more of that in a second. Um, and the first geography that I'd like to talk about is the Guyana Shield. The Guyana Shield is a mountain range on the northeastern corner of South America. The country of Guyana is sort of right in the middle of the Guyana Shield, but the shield itself actually extends into Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, French Guyana, Brazil, and there's actually a little piece of it that pokes into Colombia. It's a very old mountain range, much older than the Andes. And what we now know is the Amazon River actually once flowed from the Guyana Shield Mountains into the Pacific Ocean before the Andes uplift. So that's just kind of an interesting little trivia fact for anybody here who thinks on geological time. One really important feature of the Guyana Shield Mountains is that they capture a lot of the moisture that's coming into the Amazon basin. They capture that most of the moisture comes in from the Atlantic. And these mountains and the forests on these mountains capture that moisture as it comes off the ocean. And then they slowly release it back into the atmosphere through evaporation and evapotranspiration, and play a key role in regulating the climate across the entire Amazon basin. So that, the moisture that's captured there is slowly released throughout the Amazon basin throughout the year. So a lot of people who are thinking about climate change, thinking about the health of the Amazon basin, thinking about the tipping point of the Amazon basin, which for people who are not familiar with it is the idea that at some point with enough deforestation, the Amazon may turn from a net carbon sink with large standing forests to something more like a savanna, if it ceases to capture as much moisture as it's currently capturing. And the Guyana Shield plays a big role in capturing that moisture and distributing it across the Amazon basin, keeping the basin itself humid and moist and keeping it a tropical forest. And to the extent that the Amazon basin plays a key role in global climate, you're looking at a small piece of South America that plays a huge role in the health of not just the Amazon basin, but our planet. Um, so there's a lot of science behind this. I put a link to one of the articles there, and I did my best job to put together a little infographic about how that moisture flow works there on the right. Happy to talk more about that later in the question and answer session. However, despite how fantastic the Guyana Shield is, how stunningly beautiful it is, and all of the moisture it captures, it is also has the sort of um, uh, uh, dubious recognition of being really important for global climate, and also a place where there are a lot of subsurface minerals, primarily gold and diamonds, but also things like bauxite. And increasingly, they are finding rare earth minerals in Guyana. So those forests and the indigenous communities that live on and around those forests are under pretty severe threat right now from gold mining and other types of extractive industry. So what we're looking at right now is sort of a small moment in time where we can try to establish larger indigenous territories in Guyana and stop the spread of these large-scale mining claims. What you're looking at in this map in green are the currently titled indigenous communities in Guyana. What you're seeing, that sort of grid of black squares, are current mining claims and prospecting permits. So you can see that a huge portion of the country is covered in these claims, and these are just the officially recognized large and medium scale mining claims in Guyana. They are not all of the claims in Guyana, and they're certainly not reflective of the illegal mining and other stuff that's going on in Guyana. So that gives you a sense of the stakes and the immediate threat in Guyana. The other aspect of that threat is that a lot of oil was discovered off the coast of Guyana recently. Some of the largest oil reserves in the world. These oil reserves are currently being developed primarily by Exxon, and some of the royalties from those reserves are going to the government of Guyana, as they should. But the government of Guyana is using those oil revenues to build out infrastructure in the country. So that infrastructure looks like improved airstrips, new roads, basically new ways to access the rugged interior of the country. This is often done in the name of development, and there certainly are development benefits to roads, to infrastructure, but they also lead to deforestation almost anywhere they go in. And a lot of what's protected the interior of Guyana, a lot of the reason that those mining claims that I showed you in the previous slide maybe haven't been developed or haven't been developed to the extent that they could be developed is because it's just really hard to get in there. It's really hard to get your equipment in and get the gold out. But with the investments in roads and infrastructure, it becomes a lot easier to pull gold out of those places, and poses a really imminent threat to the landscape integrity and the communities in Guyana. All of that is also on top of the fact that all of these oil reserves off the coast are eventually going to be turned into fuels that are burned in cars and factories and add to, you know, greenhouse gas emissions. So I won't get into too much more of that, but I just want to sort of paint the picture of Guyana and the Guyana Shield as a critical landscape that plays a really big role for all of us, no matter where you're from, but is also facing a pretty imminent threat. And so we're looking at kind of a window in time where we think we can support indigenous communities in the region to, address that threat. All right. So the landscape within Guyana that I'm going to talk about is called the North Pacaramus. I work in a number of different places, or we as an organization work in a number of different places in Guyana. This is one of the sort of emblematic, iconic landscapes in the country of Guyana. What you're seeing there on the left in the map is a picture of existing indigenous land titles. And if you look closely at the map, you'll see a lot of forests. You'll see a lot of clouds. And then in the sort of bottom left of the map, you'll see some savanna ecosystems. These are natural savannas that are common in this part of the Amazon basin. And you can kind of see what they look like in the pictures to the right, where you see a green mountain, and then in the foreground, a little adobe house and savanna grasses around. One thing that happened in Guyana is that indigenous communities requested very large territories initially when Guyana got its independence. And they were told by the government of Guyana that they did not have the capacity to manage those large territories. So instead of giving them a large collective territory that contained multiple different communities, they were given sort of small one by one territories for those communities that don't actually reflect how those communities use the landscape. One very interesting thing about this part of Guyana is that all of the farming, all of the hunting, almost all of the sort of spiritual and sacred sites for these communities are located in the forests. And many of the titles that were granted were really just granted to the savanna lands. So they were similar to the United States. The indigenous communities were granted sort of the lowest value land within Guyana, and they were not granted land that reflect sort of their ancestral use of the territory. And so starting in 2016, Rainforest Foundation, Forest Peoples Program, and a handful of indigenous organizations in Guyana, including APA, which is the Amerindian Peoples Association, and the North Pacaramus District Council, started really wanting to document the ancestral use of this area and understand how the existing land titles differ from how communities actually use that land. The goal of documenting all of this is to build a land case. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the sort of legal and technical details of large land cases in Guyana, but I'll go into a little bit of the process for developing these large maps. One thing I just want to note here, this picture on the top right with the flat top mountain, that's a tepui, which is a common type of mountain in this part of the world. Many people have probably seen pictures of Mount Roraima, which is another tepui that forms the border of Guyana, Brazil, and Venezuela. This is Kawa Mountain. It's at the very center of the North Pacaraima, and it's sort of the spiritual flagpole of the Patamona people who live there. On the bottom of the slide is a Patamona woman with a warshi, which is the sort of traditional backpacks of that region. What she'll do with that backpack is leave her community in the savannah, travel into the forests, and plant her farm, harvest her farm, catch fish, smoke fish, typically down by the river, and then bring all of those things back to her community. These trips are sometimes 2 days, sometimes they're 2 months. And so the people of this region really rely on those forested areas, and they rely on kind of large scale pilgrimages to the land, to the untitled lands, to get the fish, to get the meat, to do the farming that they need to survive, and also to connect with the spiritual sites like this mountain right here that you see in the top picture. And then bottom right, you can see a little bit of their cooking methods, which I still struggle to totally understand. But that is a processing pot for cassava, which is one of the staple foods that they eat in that region. So it's a mix of a big metal pan and an adobe stove underneath. So after a lot of work, and I'll go into a little bit of the sequence here, it was determined through participatory mapping that the actual lands used by the Patamona people are actually this black outline here. So that means that a little bit less than half of the lands that the Patamona people actively use, on a daily basis, on a, weekly, monthly basis. And also the location of their sort of important spiritual sites are located off of titled lands. And that this entire block, what they call there the one block, this was the original land that they applied for, and the land that they currently use today, remains untitled, especially the most important parts of that land. So for the participatory mapping, in this instance, we started by traveling to every single community in the North Pacaraima region, the titled communities or the communities that had land title, as well as some of the communities that don't have land title, and talk to them about how they use their land, talk to them about how frequently they hunt, talk to them about important sites in the area. And participatory mapping, the important piece of participatory mapping is that at its most basic, at its sort of lowest common denominator, it can be done as maps in the sand, on the floor of someone's house or outside someone's house or in a public space. A lot of the discussions that started off this project looked just like that picture there at the top of, drawing the maps in the sand. And they also sort of move on from that stage of sand drawings to working with paper maps and working with different constituent groups within the community to, take what was identified as an important site or an important activity and start placing all of those activities on, in this case, paper maps of the region. So we developed, very detailed maps of the region where we could label all of the creeks, we could label all of the mountains, and we could just talk to different groups within each community about how they use that landscape. And one important part of participatory mapping is that it is inclusive, and that means that you're speaking to many different people who use landscapes in different ways. We're talking to elders who have maybe a long-standing connection to the landscape, who know the stories of the mountains, who know the sort of myths and legends around the mountains. You're talking to the people who are actively out hunting and fishing in those areas. And then you're also talking to, youths who maybe are less connected to some of those landscapes because they haven't spent their life hunting them. But they also, hear the stories, and they also have their own way of interacting with those landscapes. So we go from those discussions in communities to actually working with community members and with local mappers to go out and get GPS locations of all of these sites, all of these important sites, and actually accompany the hunters on their 2-week hunting expedition into the forests, all with the purpose of documenting the use of these lands for an ultimate land case. And I'll talk a little bit more about the different, we talk about a land case, but it can mean slightly different things. And I'll talk about that in a second. But what you're seeing in the rest of those pictures are essentially, trips out into the field to actually find all of the spots that were referenced in the communities. This is all done by local indigenous mappers who we train. Some other organizations are also involved, and often they are able to get a lot of the sort of knowledge and mapping capacity on their own. What we're really talking about, the hard part of all of this, is actually getting to those locations. And so we try to document the use sort of throughout the region. Lots of hunting, lots of fishing, lots of just going to the places with the people that use them, and trying to understand that relationship, document it, and build it into a narrative for a land rights claim. So right here is sort of the next phase of that particular map, and you can see um, it's a little bit different than the other ones, and I apologize for that. But all of these points that you're seeing, these are all points that the community mapping teams identified in communities and then went out to capture. Um, the work that was done, this is all done on foot, and it's all done with either a GPS or a smartphone that has GPS capacity. And all of this documentation was done with communities, then validated back with the communities. And the work itself, each of these areas that you see sort of in the top of the map and you see in the bottom right of the map take about a week of hiking through the forest to get to. I'll just go back up for a second. These are the types of mountain ranges you're seeing there in the bottom. Those are the types of mountain ranges that the communities are crossing to get to their hunting grounds. Which is a little bit of a blessing and a curse, because those are also the mountain ranges that an excavator or mining equipment would have to get over in order to start extracting resources from those areas. So the communities are protected as up until now by just the sheer ruggedness of the terrain. But it's amazing how quickly a bulldozer can also cut a road through mountain ranges like that. This is the large landscape that was developed, or that was built through participatory mapping. There's a lot going on in this map, so I apologize for that in advance, but it includes the existing land titles. It also includes, in those green dotted outlines, what they call their shared use areas. These shared use areas are areas that the communities all share. They all go hunting there. They all fish there. They're sort of their pilgrimage sites throughout the year for farming, for collecting resources. They're also completely untitled. And within Guyanese law, it is illegal for multiple villages to own one piece of land. So the strategy that was developed by the communities through the participatory mapping was that individual communities would apply for title and extensions within those shared use areas, and then develop management agreements among all the communities, so that even if one of the titles, one of the extensions was specific to one community, the resources there are shared across the entire region. They had to do this because of just the idiosyncrasies of Guyanese law that don't allow for multiple communities to own a single piece of land. But they work around it by building out this type of map that identifies new land titles, new extensions that essentially fill out their larger land claim. It's a little bit like, filling out a pizza and putting wedges in so that the whole thing becomes indigenous land, and is at least entered into the public registry within Guyana as indigenous land. One important thing to note is that many land cases, the quickest land case I've ever heard of going through is about a year. Many of these are multiple years, sometimes multiple decades, and there are even instances of land claims that are worked on over a century. These are long-term processes. I will not probably be alive when many of them are complete. I mean, I hope I am. That would be wonderful. But the real purpose of all this, and one of the purposes of participatory mapping, is that we're building the capacity within the communities. We're building the collective vision for this large landscape that each successive generation can take on and can work on, even under threats and even under changes to political regimes. This particular project resulted in a book, which we have copies of on our website, with basically all of the stories from all of the different communities about how they use the land, and the history of each individual landscape. And some of these stories, go back generations to wars that were fought between different indigenous groups or colonists and indigenous groups. Absolutely fascinating work, all of which connects the people who live there to their landscape, and all of which are really the fruit of participatory mapping exercises. Um, Right now, Guyana is in the process of expanding its protected areas system, also expanding its different types of protected area designations, which include indigenous territories. So the North Pacaramas District Council that's discussed here is in the process of negotiating um, some sort of formal designation of these lands as indigenous territories, but also conservation areas that the government of Guyana can use to contribute to their global biodiversity targets. Guyana is one of many countries that is committed to covering 30% of its surface area in some sort of protected designation, including potentially indigenous territories or indigenous conserved areas. So all of this participatory mapping work has basically become the center point of discussions with the government about how these indigenous territories can help the government meet its conservation goals while also meeting local goals for land titling. Um, so let's see. I'm gonna move on from that particular story and just mention that, the participatory mapping techniques that I discussed earlier, the sort of drawing maps in the sand, drawing maps on paper, making lists of important sites, um, all of that work develops a lot of knowledge among typically certain people in the communities who want to take it further, who want to work on becoming sort of professional land stewards, professional mappers. And that's where we start getting into some of the other tools that are available to these communities to take it from, not just the traditional knowledge, but detailed technical mapping of the threats to many of the communities. So what you're seeing here are images of communities in Guyana that are using drones to map threats to their lands. So they're basically flying drones, building drone mosaics of the areas that they're flying, and using that imagery to support um, their own advocacy and to talk about threats to their lands, whether that's filing formal complaints with the government about illegal mining in their area, or reaching out to news outlets, reaching out to other types of allies that can help keep the government accountable, hold it accountable when mining activity is violating local law, violating customary law, and in many cases violating international law. So a lot of our work is focused, not just on creating the maps, but as I said, developing the capacity of the communities to, build increasingly sophisticated maps. What you see there in the bottom left is someone that I work with in, actually that person is in Panama, which I'll talk about in a second. They, over the years of participatory mapping, have become so sophisticated at it that they incorporated their own business in Panama that basically provides mapping services to indigenous territories across Central America and occasionally South America. And it's fantastic for me because I've essentially worked myself out of a job. The guy that you see there is better at every single aspect of mapping than I will ever be. And he's indigenous and works extremely well with communities and has a professional, well compensated business providing these services to indigenous communities. So the capacity that we're building is not just abstract and theoretical, but in many cases, it results in very viable, high profile careers for the indigenous people that we work with. All right, next, I'm going to talk about Panama. Um, and a lot of the context in Panama is fairly similar in that there are indigenous communities that have been recognized, but there are also a number of indigenous communities that have not been recognized. I realize we're close to time, so I'm going to go through this quickly. These right here in green are the comarcas that were established in Panama several decades ago, but they do a fairly poor job of reflecting actual indigenous use and occupation of the area. There's a lot of focus on Panama these days, largely because of the migrants who are traveling through the Darien Gap. The story that's rarely covered is that almost all of the Darien Gap is traditional indigenous territory. Those migrants are passing through indigenous lands, and in some cases making life very difficult for them. But through the course of participatory mapping over years in Panama, numerous territories were identified that were just not on the government registries in Panama. And this is all done through participatory mapping and through the support of organizations like Geo Indígena that I mentioned before. All of these territories, some of which, the ones in bright green here, have been formally recognized by the Panamanian government. The ones in yellow are in the process of recognition from the Panamanian government. But they have been removed from the cadastral, which means they've been officially set aside from available land in Panama, and are there are, numerous legal cases ongoing about threats to those lands and getting them from a yellow spot on a map to a green spot on the map. One thing I would love to see is the next time New York Times publishes a map of migrants in the Darien Gap, I'd love to see them start including some of these lands that have been claimed for, decades and that contain many, many indigenous communities. And lastly, I just want to give a real stark visual example of the conservation differences between indigenous land and non-indigenous land. This is just sort of a random satellite image screen grab of indigenous territories in the Darien versus non-indigenous territories in the Darien. Those green outlines are the territorial boundaries. You can see that within the green outlines, that's pretty much completely intact forest. The moment you get out of those collective lands into individually parcelized lands, you can see it's mostly denuded and deforested. A lot of that is cattle ranching, and that's right there in the heart of the Darien. I've got a couple more slides about sort of what the participatory mapping looks like, what the sort of process is, and what it was like in the Darien Gap. But I think I'm going to skip through them fairly quickly, or maybe that was the only one. Skip to here. Thank you, and hopefully I've left enough time for a couple questions from Sophia or anybody else on the call.
Thank you so much, Cameron. Wow, I'm consistently just like in awe of the work and how applied and important, and also just like intergenerational this is. I think that we begin to plant the seeds of this work, but this is these maps essentially will shape the future of tenure, of how people relate with land. We have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and just dive into one to kind of open the aperture a bit. And again, as I mentioned, there are people from different walks of life here. I think the common denominator is kind of land stewardship. And I'm curious how land stewards, outside of a kind of a formal argument for Indigenous tenure, can maybe apply some of these skills of participatory mapping into their own projects. And then also an addendum to that question. Have any of these maps that you've produced actually had any legal recognition and a kind of recourse for protection?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the answer to the first one is fairly simple. Yes, they have ended up in court cases, ended up in courtrooms. They have resulted in land titles. And they have, as I mentioned a second ago, they've resulted in something less than a land title, but better than nothing, which is essentially setting aside indigenous lands, so that no mining or logging concessions can be placed on them while they're under consideration by the government. In Panama, one of those areas that was set aside by the government, there was some corruption within the local environmental authority in Panama, and someone essentially took bribes to hand out logging concessions on an indigenous land that hadn't been recognized but had been excised from the public domain. And the maps that were created, both the sort of traditional maps of the landscape, as well as those same people who made the original land map, also mapped all of the resources there. And when the bulldozers started arriving, were able to map and document all of the threats to those lands. That recently, as of about a year ago, resulted in, I believe, about 20 different government officials within Panama being indicted for corruption and being sentenced to various different levels of, jail time and fines and consequences for that work. And that was all the result of community mapping and the leadership that's possible when you have, accurate maps of how you use the land and what's threatening that traditional use. So these maps are absolutely useful for sort of like external recognition and external work. And then I think the first part of your question about stewardship is a really good one, and gets to the, within our work, we typically call it governance, but I think it's, closely related to stewardship of the land. All of this information basically points to how land, and especially if you're doing participatory mapping, right, where you can, talk to people who've lived on the land for, 60 years, 70 years, who have an understanding of how certain plants are harvested, how they were harvested traditionally, how long do you wait between fishing in a specific river. A lot of that information is information that's passed down generation to generation. It's known within the community, but it possibly has never really been documented. And that's becoming more and more important as older generations pass on, and as newer generations come along. Newer generations of community members maybe don't have that traditional connection to the landscape yet. They maybe, haven't had as close of a relationship with the landscape as their grandparents did. So one really important thing is that these participatory mapping exercises facilitate intergenerational exchanges of information, and they document stuff that was, maybe once upon a time passed down orally, or passed down because the younger generation went out and hunted with their grandparents or went out and fished with their grandparents. Maybe now that younger generation is getting a job in the local school or getting a job in the local health center and is less familiar with traditional practices on those lands, but is still dependent on healthy ecosystem and healthy lands to survive for their community, for their children. So we see this as a device to basically help buffer some of the impacts of a relentless Western economy that's, constantly looking to sort of exploit resources, exploit landscapes, extract value from landscapes. And we need tools that are really up to the task of confronting those forces, because once those forces are active in a community, once the resources start getting extracted, you can lose the traditional knowledge really quickly. And it's knowledge that was developed over generation, over millennia. And so without some format for capturing it and passing it on, a lot of that knowledge can just die. And it's one of the saddest things that you see in my line of work. And I think one of the most important aspects of this. So I think it's, related to stewardship in that sense. When you have a generation that's very familiar with how to manage a landscape, has a lot of knowledge about how it's been done for generations, this offers a way to sort of document those practices and ensure that they're used in the next generation. And then, landscapes change. And I think that one thing that we do a fair amount of, that I didn't talk a whole lot about in this presentation, is use participatory mapping for developing sort of zoning of communities, for developing different, different practices, different rules, different uses within the community that the community agrees on, that are spatially explicit, that pertain to a specific river, that pertain to, a specific ecosystem within a community. This is like the most important platform for having those discussions and starting to talk about collective management of lands. One thing that I see a lot of is that many communities, as the areas around their community get deforested, get constricted, they have to be more careful than ever about conserving the resources on their land. They have to get more creative than ever about using different tools to protect the resources that are remaining, because these territories are no longer surrounded by, thousands of square miles of forest or of wild landscapes. They're increasingly surrounded by cattle farms or, something that's polluting the riverways. And so the participatory mapping allows community members to identify threats, come up with solutions, spatialize those solutions, and discuss them as a community. So, it's a tool that we use consistently for stewardship. We have a couple of papers that came out recently that talk about reduced deforestation rates on lands uh, that are, doing participatory mapping, and that are also assigning community members to um, basically do surveillance to make sure that those participatory maps and that those visions are being followed. Those communities saw an average increase, or in a single year, those communities saw a 50% decrease in deforestation rates on their lands once they started actively talking about it and actively implementing the participatory maps that were discussed in the community. So there are a lot of real world results. And last thing I'll say on this is, I've done some of this work here in the United States, working with ranchers, working with other types of private property owners, working with land trusts, and inevitably, participatory mapping is kind of the first way to bring everyone to the table and have, collective discussions about values and about solutions to problems. So, in that case, sometimes the map isn't the final product. The final product there is that you've just got everybody talking about stewardship, talking about a land that they all want to protect, but maybe they all have different visions for how it can be protected. And this tool just gets everybody around the table to have those discussions, which in this day and age is increasingly hard to get people from different points of view around the same table.
Um, so Arturo asks, what kind of equipment would be handy for these organizations for the participatory mapping to be easier and streamlined? And is there any wish list also for capacities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, one of the cool things about participatory mapping is that it can be done with very little tools, with not a lot of, you know, of investment. I think that, at its most basic, what I find really handy, is to, um, what I use is some markers, some very basic markers. And then what I really, really like to use is transparency or trace paper, which is essentially, cheap paper that people can sketch on, and then you can overlay different sketches from people. Typically, what we'll do is have people sort of identify in a list all of the important areas that the things that they think are important. They will sketch maps of those areas. But for one group, it might be fishing areas. For another group, it might be farming areas. For someone else, it might be, hey, I've just noticed this creek is always muddy because upstream there's a mining operation or something like that. And so markers and trace paper let everybody kind of put their input in, and then you can essentially do an analog overlay of all that information. I also find it really helpful to just print out large format base maps, just so that when people are sketching things, you can actually start assigning names to rivers, and you can start building out the local base map for that area, on, an actual topographic map that will have the precise location for that area. A lot can be done with that. The most important thing is that everybody feels comfortable sketching on the map. That can sometimes be the hardest thing, is just getting people to put a big Sharpie marker down on a pretty map. So I typically start by messing something up so that everybody feels comfortable sketching on the map and getting the information out of their head and onto paper. Beyond that, pretty much any smartphone these days has the capacity to map those locations. There are a number of great apps for that I'd be happy to share with anyone after the call. And then, there's also options for getting satellite imagery to, provide even more detail about landscapes. And I think, on most communities' wish lists is a drone for doing site specific mapping. These are just recreational, the same type of drones that you can buy at a store. They do an absolutely phenomenal job of mapping smaller areas, let's say 400 hectares in a single drone flight. You can get very high resolution maps with those. They're very easy to use. They're inexpensive. The only kind of tricky thing sometimes is getting the images out of the drone and plotted on a map, but that's also not hard once you understand a little bit of the technical GIS process, which is another thing I do a lot of training in different places. So that's kind of the wish list, I think. And it can start out very, very cheap and inexpensive.
Great. Georges asks, how long did the initial discussions with the community to engage, pardon me, how long did the initial discussions with the community to engage them to start the mapping work, the training of the local mappers, and the data collection would work take?
Yeah, great question. Typically, in the example I had at the top in Guyana, the process was essentially uh, trying to get word to the community that our team was arriving ahead of time. Sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's not easy. So in the instances when a community doesn't know you're showing up, it's really important to show up with respected Indigenous leaders who are known by the community. And we typically set aside an entire day to just sort of introduce the project, talk about concerns, talk about issues of data sovereignty, frankly, like, once they start putting their sacred sites on a map, whose information does that become? It's very important that that is the community's information, not my information, and that they know where the information is going. But we typically start with a day of discussions about the process. Then we often go into the sketch mapping, go into sort of the easier parts of the mapping. Through the course of the first day and the second day, typically there will be local community leaders who show a lot of interest, a lot of aptitude in the process, who are just sort of like excited to do it, excited to work on it, excited to learn how to use a GPS, maybe learn how to use a drone. So we go with those people and, um, you know, kind of bring them in as a part of the team, and they become sort of the mini facilitators for the different mapping groups within the community. Then they also become typically the field guys who are going out, guys and gals who are going out to the remote locations and capturing the spatially explicit information on a GPS. Um, the actually getting out to those areas, sometimes you can get out to a lot of the areas around a community in a couple hours, maybe a day of hard walking through the forest and on the trails, for the stuff around a community. If you're talking about hiking, 5 days through rough terrain, then you're talking about hiking 5 days through rough terrain, and there's really no way around it. My opinion, those are the best trips, but they do take, the type of planning that a five-day trip into a relatively unknown place requires. Boat travel is sometimes an option. But the other thing is that these trails, those hikes, those 5-day hikes, that's part of how the communities access those areas. So if they're saying this is an area that we hunt, that means people walk from the community to that area. That trip in and of itself is a fantastic documentation of, that's part of how they're using the landscape, is they are walking 5 days to get there, and, smoking their meat on site so that they can get it back to the community. And it's ready to eat, ready to share. So I think, the more time you can spend on the ground, the more local talent gets excited about it, the better. It helps to have someone around. You can get people fired up. And, that sort of leadership or charisma or whatever it is in my experience, not something that people learn, but something that, people naturally have. And so identifying those local community members and leaders who have that and want to apply it to community land rights, those are just the most important people, to bring into this work and to get involved and to make central to any of these mapping projects.
Amazing. I'm going to ask one last question, and I'm going to combine two questions. Eska writes, what are some of the unexpected social or cultural benefits that arise from the mapping process itself? And Ethan asks, what, if any, are parallel processes that are going on in this community alongside mapping processes? So maybe, what emerges from the actual activity of mapping itself? What have you observed?
Yeah, I think, it's really fascinating what happens, in these sessions. Often if you're speaking and it's the whole community is there and you're speaking, there are going to be a couple dominant voices in the room, who can sort of sideline people. Every time you come into a community, you're coming into, an established kind of social structure, social network, and there's going to be a couple people who play the typical role of like community leader. Um, so that's one of the reasons that I really focus on trying to break it down into smaller groups, break it down into affinity groups so that you are speaking with women, or you're speaking with mothers, or you're speaking with farmers or people who fish, or breaking it down into different themes. And so in that moment, those moments are often where you get the best information, because you're talking to someone who maybe wouldn't feel comfortable getting up in front of the whole community and talking, but would very much feel comfortable if they're sitting around the other women who do cassava farming. They would start to feel very comfortable talking about something that they know very well. And so, often you'll find that, the quiet people or the people who don't necessarily speak in the community meeting, if you can identify the right breakout groups and the right themes within a community, you can get a lot of information and a lot of discussions going that just wouldn't happen otherwise. And, the cool thing is that a lot of that work in many places has led to the formation of like women's groups and communities. I can't say that like the participatory mapping was the one thing that started a women's group or, some sort of like local agricultural collective. But there are numerous instances where, those people come to the meetings and within a year, have formed an official affinity group, and some of them have gotten bank accounts and are getting funding from various, national community development schemes for supporting things like domestic violence prevention in communities, or addressing some sort of like agricultural problem. Maybe it's pesticides, or maybe it's a plague or a blight that's affecting crops. So you often see a lot of spin-offs from these processes, and you see individuals that might not be in like a that might not have been in a community leadership position at the outset, become leaders within those affinity groups, and so that's really fantastic to see. And you see the people who, a lot of the younger people who take on this role. It's typically younger people who take on the like more technological end of participatory mapping. But, those people are all of a sudden knowledge holders in their own way. They own this sort of like community digital knowledge, and that puts them in a position of responsibility within the community. It really increases their value to the community. They feel valued, they feel seen, and they, can take those roles really seriously. We often see them becoming future, apus or caciques or tushals, depending on which country you're in. Sort of like village leaders. We often see those youths who get involved in participatory mapping take on those roles later in life, because that level of technical sophistication becomes very important to the communities, and the communities see that. I will say that has also generated some unexpected outcomes that are not necessarily desirable, because you'll often have younger people who are working with community data who become very technically proficient in using the data, in presenting the data. And maybe that person, maybe the village mapper, is the one who gets invited to the conference in the capital, or who gets paid to do some activity when like the biological survey comes to town. Um, and the traditional leader sometimes feels a little bit left out. Like an elected leader might feel like, hey, I'm the one who's elected to represent the community. And I don't necessarily have the technical skills, but here's the person who has the technical skills, who's being invited by the government to present at some panel somewhere, or being invited to, I don't know, present at some other conference. And so you have to be careful about the sort of unknown impacts of some of this work on communities. And that's the one that I see most frequently, is that the technical roles can sometimes supersede the traditional and elected roles. And so that takes a really important balance, and it takes, helping both parties kind of understand that, you know, technical proficiency is not a replacement for knowledge, wisdom, and the fact that, this person was elected by the community to represent that community. So understanding those, you're introducing a different sort of power dynamic into communities, and that's something that's very important to keep an eye on and understand and, discuss openly with the existing leaders and communities.
Cameron, that was awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who participated. We had questions coming in from Poland, Spain, South Africa, Bolivia, Peru. So we had a lot of global participation. It's amazing to just get the pulse and see that people are really interested in participatory mapping. I personally, had my mind, I guess, refreshed about a few things. I feel like participatory mapping is a tool that can be used by anyone, really, anyone who is in relationship with land. And it's a beautiful community-based way to actually support the transmission of traditional ecological knowledge and continue the long work of regenerating and stewarding land in community. So, Cameron, thank you very much. And if you would like to stay up to date on future Learning Lab offerings, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our mailing list, maearth.com. And we will also be dropping links in the show notes if you want to get in touch with Cameron, learn more about the awesome work at Rainforest Foundation. Thank you for joining us at Learning Lab, and we will see you next time.